Hi everybody. We are talking about three important major moral theories in this unit, and I wanted to hop on here and to provide a little more direction about each to hopefully help you understand a little better. So the three major moral theories I'm talking about are deontology, consequentialism, and natural law theory. I'm not so concerned with whether you have a deep understanding of natural law theory so much as the doctrine of double effect, which is part of natural law theory. But more about that in a minute. Let's start with consequentialism because it's pretty much one of the easier ones to understand. So consequentialism is pretty much what it sounds like. The moral worth of an action is dependent on the results produced. So whether if you can produce the best results, maximize the outcome, however you'd like to put it, that for a consequentialist is the best or most moral action. Utilitarianism is an example of consequentialism because it focuses on the results of an action to determine whether the action is in fact moral. Very basically, utilitarianism is the position that an action is right if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number involved. So that's it. I mean, like, I know the textbook talks about happiness, and it is important to utilitarianism because that's how the good is defined and what I just said. But ultimately, if you really want to just understand and bottom line utilitarianism is just the greatest good for the greatest number involved. And I know once you hear that, you might start put together, a lot of cultural references you've heard to that. I mean, there's a whole Star Trek movie, for example, where Spock talks about, something to that effect, the greatest good for the greatest number. That's utilitarianism. It's everywhere. I mean, you might start realizing that after this. The other moral theory is deontology. Deontology is a big word, but it's really just a fancy way of saying rule-based ethics. That means, for deontologists, an action is right if you follow a certain set of rules, standards, or principles. So, take the Ten Commandments, for example. I mean, that's a really easy point of reference that most people know. If you're trying to determine whether, if someone kills somebody, you look at those rules, thou shalt not kill, you know that the action is immoral because it violates that rule. There are 10 of them, right? This is an example of deontology because how you live your life and how you determine whether an action is in fact moral or not moral depends on following those rules. That's what deontology is. It's just following a system of rules. Kantian ethics is one of the biggest examples of deontology because the whole of Kant's system, that is how he examines and determines whether or not something is right, depends on these principles and rules and standards being followed. Now, there's a lot that goes into it, like moral obligation. I mean, supposedly to follow these rules. By virtue of moral obligation, you have to do so. So, you're going to see this in natural law theory too. The line of thinking basically is that, we're born with this idea of what's right and wrong, and by virtue of that you have moral obligations to do certain things. And that means for Kant that you understand you're supposed to follow the rule he establishes. Same thing with the Ten Commandments. I mean, supposedly, if you follow those rules, you have some sense of moral obligation to do what's right, and is defined in context of these rules that you follow. If you lie, you violated one of the Ten Commandments, and therefore it's an immoral action. In this case, for Kant, if you don't follow his categorical imperative, it's you've committed an immoral action. And categorical imperative sounds kind of scary when you put that out there too, but really it's just a fancy way to say absolute rule. Imperative is just another word for rule or command. And categorical is just another way to say absolute. I mean, if you read any part of, in the textbook about Kant, that there's a lot of, you should be able to intuit this to will it to become a universal maxim, which is just basically a way to say you should be able to intuit, that is, know by virtue of your idea of right and wrong that you're born with, that you have to follow certain rules and principles, and this is the one, this. Now, his categorical imperative is specifically to never treat anyone as a means to an end. And now that you hear me say that, you're going to go out there in the world and you're going to start noticing, there's that phrase is out there. It occurs in TV, on commercials, and everyday conversation. It comes from Kant. That's one of the most interesting things about philosophy, is that you can see where some of our ideas come from. And that idea comes specifically from Kant. And I mean, for Kant, you can allegedly derive every rule you ever need from that maxim, from his imperative, from the whole never treat someone as a means to an end. And I mean, you can see the difference between the Ten Commandments and this one little statement, right? I mean, it's a wonderful idea, but it's a bit vague, right? I mean, that's one of the flaws in it. I mean, it would be fabulous to have one universal rule that applies in all situations. You wouldn't even have to sit there and guess or determine whether or not an action is right according to this. You could just run it through the old categorical imperative and boom, But also it's difficult to know how to apply that in every case. And, I mean, it's also difficult to, each rule applies absolutely that you should never lie, that you should never steal, even if it saves someone, So let's take an example to kind of draw these together. Let's say, and I know you've probably already seen this example, but let's just run with it, that you're in a concentration camp and a commandant comes up to you and says, if you don't shoot this baby, I'm going to kill these 10,000 people. And let's just assume for sake of argument that what he's saying is true. It's gonna go down that way. Let's just assume for sake of argument that if you don't shoot that baby, there's 10,000 people right in front of your eyes going to be slaughtered. A utilitarianist would say, without question, you shoot that baby. That's the moral action. You don't feel bad about it. You don't say, oh God, I'm killing a little baby. You just do it. And it's the moral correct. It is the moral action because you saved 10,000 people by virtue of sacrificing one. And that right there, that's utilitarianism. For a deontologist, shooting that baby is morally incorrect. Deontology is not about consequences, and you might have noticed that point, or noted it, rather, from the textbook. But deontology, in the words of my old thesis professor, doesn't give a snappy hoot about the consequences. It doesn't care how many people are saved. It's all about those principles. And for deontology, killing is wrong. Period. Or murder is wrong. Let's just qualify it that way a little bit more. And say that in shooting the baby, you are murdering it. It doesn't matter how many people it saves. It's wrong to shoot that baby, because shooting it violates the holy, sacred rule of not killing or murdering. Now, in that sense, people say, I'm not the one killing these 10,000 people, but I would be the one killing this baby, and therefore it's wrong. Now, keeping that in mind, let's go to natural law theory. Now, natural law theory is pretty much the position that if it's natural, it's right. Now, I'm not trying to oversimplify that because I don't want you to think that it's only that alone. Because much like deontology, where there's this idea that we are born with this natural moral compass and we know what's right and wrong, natural law theory pretty much starts there too. I mean, it's pretty much, hey, you're born with this natural idea of good and bad, and you should be able to follow that, and that's what determines whether or not something's right or wrong. A part of natural law theory is the doctrine of double effect. You can kind of see how, you're born with this natural moral compass that you know what's right and wrong, that kind of builds into intention. You mean well because you have this natural compass and you know what's right or wrong. And granted, there's a big problem with that, but just bear with me while we define it. So, as long as you intend well, then the moral action, that's great. It's good. It's fine. It's moral. You're good. So, and that's the doctrine, I think I said it, but I want to make sure, that's the doctrine of double effect. The doctrine of double effect is that as long as you mean well, you intend well, then the action is moral. So, you see this a lot with justifying killing in wars for soldiers. For example, if murder or killing goes against your basic principles, the argument is that, well, you're not going off to war to kill people, you're going off to war to defend your country. If it so happens that you kill a few folks along the way, in the course of doing that, it's not immoral. So let's take the example of the commandant. Again, the deontologist would be completely opposed to shooting the baby, and the utilitarianist would just, bam, they'd shoot the baby, the end of story, over. A natural law theorist, or someone following the doctrine of double effect in principle, would lead us to the conclusion that if you intended well by shooting the baby, that action would be good. So I want to make sure you do understand what these theories are and what they involve. So if you do have questions, do reach out to me, please. Like I said before, when we start in on specific topics, which we begin in Unit 3 with the right to die, every article we read, every unit we read for, you're going to see one of these theories. We round out our knowledge of some of the main ethical theories in Unit 2, but really the three major ones are, from here, our doctrine of double effect, deontology and consequentialism, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics in particular. We'll touch on the others later as well, but of the ones we discuss in this unit and next, deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics, one that will be covered in the next unit, are the three most common big ones that you're going to see in everything. So if you do have questions, just make sure you reach out and ask me. I'm here and I'm happy to help, and I hope this information helps.